What if the most honest relationship you ever had started as a transaction? Not romance, not fate, a contract, signed in desperation, by two people who had already lost everything worth losing. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." She had no home, no money, no future. The only door still open was the one she never would have chosen, and behind it stood a man made entirely of silence and grief, who looked at her not with desire, but with calculation. He didn't need a wife, he needed a solution. She didn't need love, she needed to survive. And yet, here is the question that will haunt you through every word of this story. At what exact moment does a bargain become something you would die to protect? If you don't know the answer, yet stay. Watch until the very last second, because this story will show you. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, have you ever said yes to something terrifying and found your whole life waiting on the other side? Now, let the story begin. The boy stood alone in the snow. He was 8 years old, but he carried himself like someone who had already lived a long and difficult life. His dark coat was too big for his narrow shoulders. His boots left small, deliberate prints in the white ground as he walked slowly without hurry. The way children walk when they are not afraid of arriving somewhere, but afraid of what they will feel when they do. In his hand, he held a single wildflower, dried, brown at the edges, the last one he had found before the frost took everything. He stopped in front of a simple stone marker, brushed the snow from the carved letters with his bare fingers, stood very still for a moment, the wind pulling at his hair, the Montana sky pressing down pale and heavy above him. Then he placed the flower at the base of the stone and said quietly to no one who could hear him, "Papa brought someone home today, Mama. I don't know if I should be angry or relieved." He waited as if listening for an answer. None came. Eli Hale turned and walked back toward the ranch house alone, his small footprints the only mark he left behind. 3 weeks earlier, Nora Calloway had been a teacher. She had been many things before. That a daughter, a student, a young woman, with careful plans and quiet hopes, but teaching had been the one thing that felt entirely hers. The one thing she had built with her own hands out of book and stubbornness, and the deep conviction that every child deserved a chance to see beyond the horizon they were born into. She had taught for 2 years at the one-room schoolhouse in Crestwood, Montana. Small wages, cold winters, a room above the general store that let in drafts and smelled of flour and kerosene. But she had her students and her books, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child's face change the moment something clicked into understanding. She had believed that was enough. She had been wrong. The trouble began on a Tuesday in November, when Nora made a decision that seemed to her entirely obvious. A boy named Samuel arrived at the schoolhouse door, the son of a freeman, who had recently settled at the edge of the valley. He was 7 years old, serious-eyed, clutching a slate with both hands like it was something precious. He had walked 3 miles in the cold to be there. Nora had opened the door and let him in. By Thursday, 4 families had withdrawn their children. By the following Monday, Harden Cole, whose family owned half the grazing land in the county, and whose opinion the town treated as law, had arrived at the schoolhouse personally. He was a large man, red-faced, with the particular fury of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. "You're teaching filth to sit beside decent children," he said, standing in the doorway blocking the light. Nora had been erasing the chalkboard. She turned slowly and looked at him. "I am teaching a child to read," she said. "If you find that threatening, Mr. Cole, I suggest you examine why." It was perhaps not the most diplomatic response. She knew it even as she said it. But she had thought of Samuel's face when she handed him his first primer, the careful reverence with which he touched the pages, and she found she could not make herself smaller to accommodate a man like Harden Cole. He left without another word. 2 days later, she was summoned before the school board. The room was small, and the men in it did not look at her when she entered. That told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. She had seen that kind of careful avoidance before, in the faces of people who have already made a decision and don't want to be troubled by the conscience of looking at the person it affects. Edgar Wells. The board chairman was the one who spoke. He had kind eyes, which made it worse. "Your methods have been deemed divisive, Miss Calloway. The board has voted to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll need to vacate your room above the store by week's end." "Mr. Wells." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. "The school year is not yet half finished. The children, a replacement has already been arranged." He paused. "We appreciate your service." That was all. She walked out into the cold and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long time, the wind working its way through her thin coat, and tried to understand how 3 weeks could so completely dismantle 2 years of careful building. She thought of Richard then. She could not help it. Richard, who had been her intended 2 years before, in a different town, when she had lost a different position for a different principled stand. Richard, who had held her hands and told her he admired her courage right up until the moment it became inconvenient. Right up until the moment she had nothing left to offer him but herself. "I need stability, Nora," he had said. Gently, as if gentleness made it less of an abandonment. "I need someone whose life isn't always on fire." She had not cried when he left. She had told herself that was strength. She was no longer sure it had been. The valley ranches were her only option. She had no family left, her mother 3 years gone, her father long before that. No connections she could call on. No savings beyond what would cover a week's food. She packed what she owned into a single carpet bag. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a worn coat that had seen better winters, and the small collection of books she had accumulated over years of careful saving, and she set out on foot. The first ranch turned her away politely. The second turned her away less politely. By the 3rd day, the sky had turned the color of old iron, and the temperature had dropped with the sudden violence of a Montana December. What had been merely cold became something with intention, something that pushed its fingers through every gap in her coat and her boots and her resolve. She kept walking. She told herself she was not afraid. She told herself that someone with her education, her skills, her willingness to work would find a place. She told herself these things with the mechanical determination of someone who knows they are lying, but cannot afford to stop. She was still telling herself these things when her legs gave out. She did not fall dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. Her knees simply stopped working the way knees are supposed to work, and she sat down heavily against a fence post, and the cold that had been pursuing her finally caught her. She thought distantly that she should get up, that sitting in the snow was dangerous, that she needed to move. She thought of her mother's voice singing somewhere far back in memory. She closed her eyes. "Ma'am?" The voice came from a great distance, or perhaps it was close, she could no longer tell. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She opened her eyes. A weathered face peered down at her. A man in his 50s, frost on his mustache, concern, deep in the lines around his eyes. "Lord Almighty," he said softly. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for work," Nora said. Her voice came out strange, thick, like it belonged to someone else. "I can teach, or cook, or clean. I can—" "Hush now." And he pulled her upright with surprising strength, wrapping one arm around her shoulders. "Can't help you there, but I can't leave you to freeze either. Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." His name he told her as he half carried her through the gate and down the long road toward the distant buildings, was Charlie. He was the foreman of Hale Ranch. The iron gate behind her bore a large letter H, worked into its design set between stone pillars that spoke of permanence and money and a particular kind of confidence. The road wound through snow-covered grassland that seemed to go on much further than she could see. Ahead, a house rose against the gray sky stone, and timber went fronted, with 2 chimneys, putting out smoke into the cold air. It was the largest house she had ever approached on foot. "The boss might have some ideas," Charlie said, as if this explained everything. Nora did not have the strength to ask what kind of ideas he meant. The kitchen was warm, in a way that felt almost painful after the cold, outside the kind of warmth that makes you aware of how frozen you had become, that turns numbness back into sensation, and sensation briefly back into pain, before it becomes relief. A stout woman with flour on her apron looked up sharply when Charlie brought Nora through the side door. "Charlie, what on earth?" "Found her collapsed at the gate, Mrs. May. She's near frozen. I need to fetch the boss." The woman May, apparently and clearly a person who expressed care through efficiency rather than sentiment, clicked her tongue and immediately took charge. She wrapped Nora in a blanket that smelled of cedar. She pressed warm cider into her hands and watched with sharp eyes to make sure it was drunk slowly. She scolded Nora at some length about the foolishness of wandering the valley alone in winter, without proper clothing, which Nora understood was a form of kindness. Through an interior door came sounds Nora had not heard in weeks. The sounds of a house that contained children, a high voice asking a question, a lower voice responding with the particular patience of a parent who has answered the same question many times. Then with laughter, brief and bright like a bird flying through a room. She had not realized until she heard it how much she had missed that sound. She was still sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the mug, when Charlie returned. "Boss says he'll see her," he told May. Then to Nora, "Can you walk, miss?" "Yes." She stood carefully testing her legs. They held. "Then come on. He doesn't like waiting." The house was larger on the inside than it had appeared from outside. Hallways that smelled of beeswax and something older wood smoke and leather. The particular smell of a place that has been lived in for a long time. She passed a parlor furnished with expensive pieces that seemed to have been arranged, and then left alone as if someone had started making a home, and then simply stopped caring. A music room with a piano. A dining room with a long table that could seat 20 but held only 4 place settings. There were conspicuous absences. Spaces where things should have been. Gaps in the arrangement of furniture that suggested removal rather than incompleteness, as if certain objects had been taken away all at once deliberately, and nothing had been moved since to fill the emptiness they left. She did not understand what she was seeing yet. Charlie stopped before a closed door at the end of the main hallway. A line of warm light showed beneath it. He knocked twice and opened it without waiting for an answer. "Miss Calloway, sir," he said, and stood back to let her pass. The study was lined with books, proper books, hundreds of them, filling shelves from floor to ceiling on 2 walls. A fire burned in the grate. A large desk dominated the center of the room, covered in papers and ledgers, with the organized density of a man who works with numbers daily and trusts them more than most things. Behind the desk sat Jonathan Hale. Nora's first thought was that he looked like the land. Not the soft parts of it, not meadows or rivers, but the hard parts. The cliff faces, the stone ridges, the places where the earth refused to accommodate anything, and simply was. He was perhaps in his early 30s, dark-haired with the first touch of gray at his temples, and a face tanned and creased by years of outdoor work. His eyes, when he looked up from his papers, were an unexpected shade of blue, sharp pale, and entirely unreadable. He studied her for a long moment, assessed her the way a man accustomed to making practical decisions assesses a situation quickly, thoroughly, without apparent feeling. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was even unhurried. "Nora Calloway, the schoolteacher from Crestwood." It was not a question. Nora straightened despite herself. She was bedraggled and half frozen and wearing a coat with a hole in the left elbow, and she was determined to have some dignity regardless. "You know of me, Mr. Hale. I make it my business to know what happens in this valley." He set down his pen. "I know Edgar Wells dismissed you. I know why." A pause. "Sit down before you fall down." She sat. The leather chair was deep and warm, and she was grateful for it in a way she could not afford to show. "You have no family," he said. It was not a question either. "My parents are deceased. I have no siblings." She lifted her chin. "If I had better options, Mr. Hale, I wouldn't be here." Something moved briefly across his face. Not quite amusement. Perhaps something closer to respect. It was gone before she could be certain. "Charlie says you were asking about work. I'm willing to do whatever is needed. I'm a hard worker. I learn quickly." "I have a housekeeper," Jonathan said, "and my ranch hands are hired men who've worked cattle their whole lives. I have no position to offer you." He paused, and she heard the weight in the pause, felt the "however" before he spoke it. "What I have is a different kind of proposal." He stood from behind the desk and moved to the fireplace, standing with his back to it, the flames outlining him from behind, looking at her directly without deflection. "I need a mother for my sons," he said. "You need shelter. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Calloway. Not love, not companionship. A practical arrangement. You'll have a roof, food, and my name. My boys will have stability and someone to raise them properly. Do we have an understanding?" The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the windows with a sound like held breath. Nora stared at him. This stranger who had just proposed marriage with the same tone another man might use to discuss the price of grain. She waited for something in his expression to shift, for uncertainty or awkwardness, or anything that suggested he understood the gravity of what he had just said. Nothing shifted. He was entirely serious. "You're proposing marriage," she said slowly, "to a woman you have never met. I know considerably more about you than you might think. I know you stood on principle against a man like Harden Cole, knowing what it would cost you. I know you are educated, which means you can teach my sons properly. I know you are here, which means you understand survival." His voice was flat. "This isn't a romantic notion. It's a transaction. You'll have your own room. You'll be expected to take charge of the household, to mother my children, to appear as my wife in public. In return, you'll have security, comfort, and my protection. You'll never want for anything material. And you," she found her voice from somewhere, "what do you get beyond someone to raise your children? Stability, Routine. The appearance of a normal household which benefits my sons. He held her gaze without flinching. And I will be honest, it will silence the widows and daughters who circle every time I go to town. I have no interest in remarrying for love, Miss Calloway. I loved my wife. That chapter is closed. The way he said it, not with bitterness, not with grief, but with the quiet finality of a door that has been locked from the inside, told her everything she needed to know about the state of Jonathan Hale's heart. It was not merely closed. It had been sealed deliberately. "How long ago did you lose her?" Nora asked, though she was not sure why. A muscle moved in his jaw. 3 years, shortly after our younger son was born. 3 years, and still the door locked. "Tell me about your sons," she said. For the first time, something genuinely human moved across his face. Not warmth exactly, but a loosening, like stone that has been in sun long enough to lose some of its cold. "Eli is 8. He is intelligent, too intelligent for his own comfort sometimes. Since his mother died, he has appointed himself the man of the house. He needs to learn how to be a child again." A pause. "Caleb is 3. He never knew his mother. He needs consistency and he needs someone who will simply be there. And they would accept a stranger as their mother. Just like that. Children adapt. You're a teacher. You know how to build trust with young people." She had built trust with students. But students were not sons. Sons were something else entirely. She thought of Richard again briefly, of how quickly conditional affection could evaporate, and pushed the thought away. "I have conditions," she said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow very slightly, as if he had not expected this. "You will never raise a hand to me. I will be treated with respect, regardless of the nature of our arrangement. In matters concerning the children, you will support me in front of them, no contradicting my authority in their presence." And she stopped. This last one felt small and foolish, but she said it anyway. "My books. I have a small collection. I want to keep them." "The house has a library," Jonathan said. "You're welcome to it." He extended his hand across the space between them. "Do we have an agreement?" She looked at his hand. Large, calloused, absolutely steady. The hand of a man who had never doubted himself in his life. If she took it, she was committing to a path that would require things from her she wasn't certain she possessed. If she didn't, she was walking back into that cold. She heard her mother's voice from someplace deep in memory. "Survive, Nora. Whatever it takes." She took his hand. "We have an agreement." May showed her to a guest room on the second floor, talking the entire way with the particular energy of a woman who fills silence with words because she knows silence can hold difficult things. The room was simple and clean, a bed with a heavy quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand, a window that looked out over fields that were white and quiet under the evening sky. May brought warm water and a bar of soap that smelled of lavender and a flannel nightgown that she placed on the bed with a care that suggested it had belonged to someone specific. "This was Mrs. Hale's," she said quietly. "Sarah's. The master keeps her things in storage, but—" She paused, smoothing the fabric. She'd have wanted them used. She was practical that way. Nora looked at the nightgown and felt the full strangeness of the situation settle over her. She was going to wear a dead woman's clothes, sleep in a room that smelled faintly of another woman's life, become by legal arrangement the mother of children she had not yet properly met. "What was she like?" Nora asked. May settled into the chair by the window with a soft exhale. the exhale of someone setting down a weight they carry constantly. Sarah was sunshine, she said. That's the only word that fits. She lit up rooms, made people feel seen. This house, it had warmth, then real warmth. She and the master they were. She stopped, shook her head gently. They were deeply in love. Anyone within 10 feet of them could feel it. What happened? Caleb's birth was difficult from the beginning. The doctor had warned her early in the pregnancy there were complications with her blood, something he couldn't fix. She chose to continue. May's voice was steady, but her eyes were distant. She knew the risk. She didn't tell Jonathan. She made that choice herself. The words settled into the room with a particular heaviness. He didn't know she was in danger, not until there was nothing to be done. She hemorrhaged. The doctor tried. But May folded her hands in her lap. Her last words to him were, "Take care of our boys. Don't let grief make you hard." Nora looked at the window at the dark fields beyond and thought about a man who had been given an instruction by the person he loved most and had failed to keep it, who had known every day for 3 years exactly how he was failing, that she thought explained considerably more than the locked heart. He blamed himself, she said. Every day since. May stood smoothing her apron. The boys are the same. Eli especially. That child carries things he shouldn't have to carry. She paused at the door. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Calloway. Whatever the circumstances, this house needs someone willing to fight for it." She looked at Nora steadily. "Are you—" "I don't know yet," Nora said honestly. May nodded, as if honesty was exactly what she had hoped for. "Then I suppose you'll find out." Morning came gray and still. Nora dressed in her better dress, worn at the elbows, but cleaned the dark green one that at least fit properly, and pinned her hair back as neatly as she could manage without a proper mirror. Then she went downstairs to meet the household she had contracted to join. Breakfast was served in the dining room, 4 place settings. Jonathan sat at the head of the table reading a newspaper with the focused stillness of a man who uses busyness as a form of absence. 2 boys sat opposite each other. The younger one, Caleb, had his father's coloring, but a round, open face that belonged entirely to itself. He was spooning porridge with the industrious concentration of a 3-year-old engaged in very serious work. He looked up when Nora entered, and his face immediately rearranged itself into delight. The older one, Eli, did not move. He watched Nora approach the table with eyes that were disconcertingly like his father's in their assessment, though in the son they held an additional quality, a careful sadness pressed down and smoothed over the way ice forms over moving water. "Boys," Jonathan said without looking up from his newspaper, "this is Miss Calloway. Miss Calloway, my sons, Eli and Caleb." "Hello," Nora said, taking the seat May indicated. "It's very nice to meet you both." Caleb put down his spoon. "Are you going to be our new mama?" he asked, with the directness that 3-year-olds consider entirely appropriate. "Caleb," Jonathan's voice carried a warning. But Papa said, "I know what I said. Let Miss Calloway eat her breakfast." Caleb subsided, but continued to study Nora with unabashed curiosity and apparent goodwill. Eli said nothing. He had returned his gaze to his own bowl, but Nora was aware of the way he was listening, the particular quality of attention that children deploy when they want information but don't want to appear to want it. The meal passed in a particular kind of strained silence that Nora recognized as the silence of people who are accustomed to not speaking to each other. When it was done, Jonathan stood and announced without looking at Amicia anyone in particular that he had work to attend to and that Miss Calloway should familiarize herself with the house. "Eli will show you around," he said, and left before she could respond. She looked at Eli across the table. Eli looked back at her with those careful, too old eyes. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I beg your pardon. Show you around. You don't want to be here, I can tell." He said it without accusation, simply as observation, as fact. "You'd rather be anywhere else." The accuracy of it stopped her breath briefly. She set down her napkin and considered him, this 8-year-old, with the posture of someone braced for a blow that might come from any direction. "You're right," she said. "This is strange and uncomfortable, and I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing. But your father has offered me something I need, and I've accepted. I understand that's difficult for you." Eli's expression shifted slightly, as if her honesty had been unexpected. "Why do we need someone?" he said. "We were fine." "Were you?" she asked gently. Something cracked in his face just briefly, just a hairline fracture in the careful composure before he pulled it back. "I take care of Caleb," he said. "I help May. I manage." "You're 8 years old, Eli. You shouldn't have to manage." She paused. "You should be learning, making mistakes, playing, being a child. Someone has to be the grown-up." She looked at him for a long moment, at this boy who had decided at some point after his mother died that being a child was a luxury he no longer had access to, who had bent himself into the shape of something smaller and harder than he was, and called it responsibility. "May I?" She gestured toward him. He looked at her hand, uncertain, suspicious. Then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, he gave a tiny nod. She put her arm around his shoulders carefully, felt the tension in him, the rigid effort not to respond. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," she said quietly. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. But you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. And perhaps," she chose her words with care, "perhaps I can help carry some of it, if you'll let me." For a moment, Eli held himself completely still. Then, very slightly, he leaned into her shoulder. Just a fraction. Just enough that she could feel it. He pulled away almost immediately, straightened, looked at her with an expression that was not quite softened, but was no longer entirely closed. "I'll show you the house," he said, "but don't expect me to like you yet." "Fair enough," said Nora. The house tour took the better part of the morning. It was Nora discovered a house of contradictions. Beautiful rooms that had not been properly inhabited in years. Furniture arranged, as if for use, dust covers absent but no signs of actual living. A parlor with expensive upholstered chairs that held the faint impression of people who used to sit in them. A music room with a piano that was slightly out of tune, in a way that suggested not disuse, but imprecision. Someone had been playing it occasionally but not tuning it. A nursery on the upper floor, the door half open. A rocking chair. A small painted crib. Everything arranged as if a child might still sleep there, as if time had stopped on a particular night 3 years ago, and this room had simply not been informed. "Caleb doesn't sleep in there anymore," Eli said, watching her face. "He was moved to the room next to mine when—" He stopped. "Papa moved him. I see." There was one closed door at the far end of the upper hallway, the only closed door in the house. Eli did not gesture toward it or explain it. He walked past it as if it did not exist. Nora did not ask. There was also, she discovered, a library, and the library, unlike the rest of the house, was alive. Books filled the walls, arranged with the casual organization of a man who actually reads them rather than displays them. A rolling ladder, deep leather chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light, a side table that held an empty glass, and a book left open face down, spine creased. She stopped in the doorway and felt something loosen in her chest, the particular relief of recognizing a kindred language. "Papa reads here at night," Eli said from beside her, "after we're in bed." "Does he?" She stepped inside, running her fingertips along the spines. "He used to read to us." Eli's voice was careful, neutral. He stopped. Nora turned to look at him. "Do you miss it?" A long pause. "Yes," said Eli Hale, in the voice of a boy who does not often admit to missing things. Nora filed this away with the careful attention she had always given to the things her students could not quite say directly. "I'll read to you," she said, "if you'd like." He looked at her for a moment. Then he shrugged the elaborate performative shrug of a child attempting to appear indifferent. "Maybe," he said. She took it as a yes. The circuit judge arrived in Crestwood on the third day after Nora's arrival, and Jonathan sent Charlie to fetch him that same afternoon. The ceremony took place the following morning in the study. Judge Alderman was a compact man in his 60s, with the practiced blankness of someone who has officiated every kind of human arrangement and stopped being surprised by any of them. He accepted payment from Jonathan, shook hands with Charlie and May as witnesses, and opened his book without ceremony. The study had been slightly rearranged, furniture pushed back to create a small open space before the fireplace. May stood near the door with her hands folded and her eyes already suspicious of their own tendency toward moisture. Charlie stood beside her, uncomfortable, in a clean shirt. Jonathan stood before the fire. He had changed into a dark coat that made him look more formidable rather than less. He looked at Nora when she entered a single clinical sweep and nodded. The nightgown had been Sarah's. This dress would have to do as a wedding dress. Nora had pinched color into her cheeks and arranged her hair with the extra pins May had pressed into her hand that morning without comment. She was aware walking into the room of wearing a dead woman's possessions and preparing to step into a dead woman's life, and of how very strange it was that this felt less impossible than walking back into the snow. The judge began. The words came as if from a great distance. Familiar words. She had heard them at other people's weddings, had imagined them for her own, had imagined a church and flowers, and a man who looked at her as if she were remarkable. "Jonathan Ezekiel Hale. Do you take this woman?" "I do." Flat, empty of inflection, a contractual obligation fulfilled. "Nora Ann Calloway. Do you take this man?" The room was very quiet. She thought of Samuel walking 3 miles in the cold with his primer clutched in both hands. She thought of Richard saying, "I need someone whose life isn't always on fire." She thought of her mother's voice telling her to survive. "I do," she said. The ring was gold, and slightly too large. It had been Jonathan's mother's, he had explained the night before, and would be sized after the ceremony. When he slid it onto her finger, she felt its looseness, its imprecision, and curled her fingers to keep it from sliding off. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride if so inclined." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then Jonathan leaned forward and pressed a brief, impersonal kiss to her forehead, the way a man might acknowledge a business agreement, the way a person marks a document rather than a person. It was, Nora thought, entirely appropriate for what this was. May made a sound that was either a sob or a sneeze. Probably both. The paperwork was completed. Judge Alderman departed, declining lunch with the efficiency of a man who has places to be. And Nora Calloway stood in the study of Hale Ranch, as Maud Nora Hale, wearing a ring that did not fit in a house that was not yet a home, belonging to a family that was not yet a family. Caleb appeared in the doorway seconds later, as if he had been waiting outside. "Is it done? Is Miss Calloway our mama now? Mrs. Hale," Jonathan said. "Yes." "Can I call you Mama?" Caleb asked, already moving toward Nora with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has decided something and sees no reason to delay it. The question landed somewhere in the center of her chest. "If you'd like," she managed. He threw his arms around her waist with the full commitment of a 3-year-old and held on. And Nora felt his small, solid warmth and breathed carefully and did not cry. Over his head, she looked at Eli. Eli stood in the doorway. He had come in quietly behind his brother, and now he stood watching this scene with an expression she could not fully read: grief and longing and resistance, and something that might, under different circumstances, have been hope. Then he turned and walked out. "Eli," Jonathan's voice was sharp, "come back here." "Let him go," Nora said quietly. "He needs time. This is difficult." Jonathan looked at her. For a moment, she thought he would argue. "He needs to learn manners," he said. "He needs to learn that it's safe to feel things," Nora said. "That comes first." Another silence, briefer this time. Jonathan turned and left the room without further comment. May, from across the room, caught Nora's eye and gave her a look that contained, Nora thought, a small measure of approval. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Nora did something she had been waiting to do since Charlie first brought her through the gate. She went to the library. She chose a book at random, Shakespeare the Sonnets, and curled into one of the leather chairs and let the words wash over her with the particular relief of returning to something familiar. The fire crackled. The house made its nighttime sounds around her. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet against the dark windows. She had been there perhaps an hour when she became aware that she was not alone. She looked up. Jonathan stood in the doorway, still in his work clothes, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the assessing look. Not the flat practicality. Something else. Something she could not name that had in it a quality almost like surprise. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "I'm sorry. I should have asked." "No." He stepped into the room, moved to the other chair, stood behind it without sitting. "You're welcome to it. I said that." He looked at the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" "The Sonnets." Something moved across his face, a response he hadn't intended to show, gone quickly. "Sarah liked those," he said. The room was quiet for a moment. "May told me about her," Nora said carefully. "About what happened?" Jonathan's hand tightened briefly on the back of the chair. "May talks. She cares about you, about the boys." Nora set the book in her lap. "Mr. Hale." "Jonathan. We're married." "Jonathan." The name was strange in her mouth, too intimate for what they were not intimate enough, for what they had technically become. "I want you to know that I have no intention of trying to make you forget her, or to replace what she was to this family. I understand that's not what this is." He looked at her steadily. His eyes in the firelight were a darker blue than they appeared in daylight. "Then what is it?" he said. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said honestly. "But I think we have the same goal. The boys. Their well-being. Their happiness." She met his gaze. We can start there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved around the chair and sat. Not with relaxation, not with ease, but with the deliberate heaviness of a man setting down something he has been carrying. "May also told you other things," he said. "Not a question." "Some." "Then you know." He stopped. Started again. "You know that I'm not, that this arrangement is the extent of what I'm capable of at present." "I know that you believe that," Nora said. He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze without flinching. She had spent 2 years holding the gaze of 8-year-olds who were testing her authority. She was not going to be outmaneuvered by a grown man. After a moment, something shifted, not a softening exactly, but a small recalibration. "You're very direct," he said. "I'm a teacher. It's an occupational requirement." He almost smiled. She saw the edges of it, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth before it was suppressed. "Good night, Mrs. Hale," he said, standing. "Good night, Jonathan." He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway, heard the distant sound of a door opening and closing. She sat with the Shakespeare in her lap for a while longer, looking at the fire. It was only when she stood to go upstairs that she remembered she had left her own carpetbag in the guest room, and she had not yet been shown where she would actually be sleeping now that the ceremony was done. May had mentioned that first night the mistress's chambers, Sarah's rooms. Nora climbed the stairs slowly and found May waiting at the top, with the patient expression of someone who has been expecting this conversation. "I was wondering when you'd come looking," the housekeeper said. "Come on, I'll show you." The mistress's chambers were at the end of the upper hallway, the same hallway with the closed door that Eli had walked past, without comment that morning. Not the same door. Adjacent. The master's bedroom was behind the locked door. The mistress's chambers opened off a shared sitting room between them, connected but separate with a daybed in the sitting room that May pointed to with careful casualness. "The master suggested you'd find this arrangement comfortable," she said in the tone of someone delivering a message they did not entirely endorse. "Separate sleeping rooms, very common in households of this kind." "I'm sure it is," Nora said. She looked around at Sarah's bedroom. The wallpaper was pale yellow with small flowers. A dressing table held brushes still arranged in a particular order. The curtains were heavy velvet dark green. Everything was beautiful and perfectly maintained, and entirely saturated with the presence of a woman who was no longer there. A faint ghost of lavender in the curtains. A shawl draped over the chair that May said softly had been Sarah's favorite for cold evenings. The particular way the furniture was arranged, not by interior logic, but by habit, by the repeated movements of a person who had placed things where her hands naturally fell. Nora's meager belongings. Carpetbag, 2 dresses. Her mother's Bible, her books looked pale and small when May transferred them into the large wardrobe. "The master says you're to use Sarah's things," May said. "The dresses will need altering, but there's fabric and household money for whatever you require. You're the mistress here now." The word sat strangely. Mistress, with all its weight of authority and possession. "May," Nora said, and the housekeeper paused. "Was there a letter? People sometimes, when they know they might." May looked at her for a long moment. "There was a letter," she said carefully. "The master has it. He's never—" She stopped. "He has it." Nora nodded slowly. She did not ask more. It was not hers to ask. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. She changed into Sarah's flannel nightgown. It was too long, and smelled of cedar from the storage, and climbed into the large bed, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Somewhere behind the sitting room wall, Jonathan Hale lay in his own bed, behind the door that was always locked in the room that held whatever it held. Down the hall, Eli was probably not sleeping. Caleb probably was. This was her household now. These were her people. This strange, grief-weighted, half-frozen collection of a man and two boys, and a housekeeper, and a foreman, and a ranch full of workers, and a library full of books, and a locked door at the end of a hallway. She had survived the winter. She had said yes to the impossible. What came next, she had absolutely no idea. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would begin to find out. She was almost asleep when she remembered something. Earlier that day, helping May reorganize the study after the wedding, she had straightened the papers on Jonathan's desk. Under a ledger, she had seen a small slip of paper with her name on it. Not Miss Calloway. Not the schoolteacher from Crestwood. Her name, Nora, written in a hand she now recognized as Jonathan's. Under it, 3 words. She will stay. She had thought it strange at the time and had set it aside to think about later. Now in the dark of Sarah's room, she thought about it. She will stay. Not she might stay. Not perhaps she will do. A statement, an assertion, written in Jonathan Hale's careful, deliberate hand on a piece of paper tucked beneath a ledger before she had arrived. Before their conversation. Before the agreement. He had known she was coming before she got here. He had known her name. He had written with apparent certainty that she would stay. Nora lay in the dark and turned this over and could not make it fit the shape of the man who had proposed a cold transaction in a study and pressed a perfunctory kiss to her forehead. A man who did not feel things would not write those words. A man who had truly locked his heart would not write those words. She stared at the ceiling for a long time after that, listening to the wind outside and the settling sounds of the house around her, and thought about the difference between a door that is locked because there is nothing behind it, and a door that is locked because whatever is behind it is too important to risk. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless. And in the morning, for the first time in 3 weeks, she was not afraid of what the day would bring. The first thing Nora changed was the curtains. Not dramatically, not all at once. She simply opened them, the heavy drapes in the parlor that had been drawn against the winter light, keeping the room in a permanent gray dusk that served no purpose except perhaps to match the mood of the man who lived there. She pulled them back one morning while May watched from the doorway with the expression of someone witnessing something that might either be very good or very beyond, and is not yet sure which. Light fell across the parlor floor in long, pale rectangles. Dust particles rose and drifted. The room looked for a moment startled. "The master doesn't like bright rooms," May said carefully. "The master isn't in this room," Nora said. "The boys are." Caleb, who had been sitting on the rug, attempting to build a tower out of wooden blocks, looked up at the sudden light with an expression of pure delight. He held out his arms as if he could catch it. "Send," he announced with the satisfaction of someone confirming an important fact. May watched this for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen without further comment. That was how it began. Small adjustments, incremental changes. Nora did not attempt to remake the house all at once, she understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years learning how to enter spaces that belonged to others and make herself useful without being threatening that the right pace mattered as much as the right action. She opened curtains. She moved a chair from a corner to a window where it could catch afternoon light. She brought a small vase of dried winter berries from the kitchen and set it on the dining table, where it had no practical purpose whatsoever and a considerable amount of life. Jonathan noticed these changes. She could tell by the way his gaze moved across a room when he entered it. The slight pause. The recalibration before he settled into his chair or his newspaper or whatever form of deliberate absence he had chosen for that particular hour. He said nothing about them. She took his silence as permission to continue. The question of the boys' education resolved itself within the first week. Miss Davies, the tutor who came 3 times a week from town, was a competent woman. In the narrow sense, she arrived promptly, maintained order, and could be relied upon to ensure that Eli had memorized his multiplication tables and Caleb had practiced his letters. What she could not be relied upon was making either of them want to. Nora sat in on a lesson on the 3rd day. She sat quietly in the corner and watched. Eli worked through arithmetic problems with the mechanical precision of someone completing an obligation rather than learning something. His hand moved across the slate with perfect accuracy and complete disengagement, the way very intelligent children perform when they have understood that the purpose of the exercise is performance rather than understanding. Caleb at 3 was not expected to do much beyond sit still and practice his name. He was not especially good at sitting still. His eyes kept wandering to the window where a crow was doing something interesting in the snow outside. After 20 minutes, Nora could not help herself. "Excuse me, Miss Davies," she said, standing. "Would you mind if I borrowed the boys for the afternoon? I'd like to assess their progress myself." Miss Davies' expression suggested that she minded quite a bit, but that she was not in a position to say so to the mistress of the household. When she had gathered her things and departed, Nora turned to the boys. "Right," she said. "What do you actually like?" Caleb said immediately. "Horses." Eli said nothing in the careful way of someone who has learned that expressing preferences can be used against you. "What do you read?" Nora asked him directly. "Whatever Miss Davies assigns." "That's not what I asked." A pause. He looked at her assessingly, checking she thought whether this was a trap. "Geography," he said finally. "Maps. I like knowing where places are, how they connect." "Excellent." Nora stood and moved toward the door. "Library. Both of you. We're going to learn about the Mongol Empire." Caleb scrambled off his chair immediately. Eli followed more slowly with the carefully maintained skepticism of a boy who has decided to be interested but is not ready to show it. The afternoon disappeared. Nora pulled maps from the library shelves, proper map and the kind with hand-drawn routes and faded ink that showed the world before telegraph lines and railroad schedules, flattened it into something manageable. She spread them across the reading table and let Eli trace the routes with his finger, while she read aloud the vast grasslands. The horse archers who could shoot accurately at a full gallop the empire that had stretched from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. Caleb was riveted by the horses. Of course he was. She had known he would be. She described the Mongolian steppe ponies, small and hardy, and capable of traveling enormous distances on almost nothing, and watched his face change from mild interest to complete absorption. Eli absorbed everything. She could see him storing it, filing it, building connections she hadn't suggested. When she described the trade routes of the Silk Road, he reached across her and pointed to a different map, the Mediterranean, and said, "Is that why the spice trade moved here, after the empire collapsed?" She stared at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly. How did you know that? He shrugged the elaborate shrug. I read. What do you read? Another pause, then reluctant as if giving something away. Papa's books, the history ones. He doesn't mind. She looked at this boy, this 8-year-old, who read serious history books alone at night, probably because he could not sleep, and because the books were full of the same stories his father was clearly drawn to. Stories of empires, built and lost, of men who built great things, and then watched them fall of the way. Time dismantles everything eventually. She thought she was beginning to understand Eli Hale. You're a good teacher, he said quietly, when Caleb had run off to find a toy horse. His voice had the particular care of someone who does not give compliments easily. Better than Miss Davies. Thank you. Why did you stop? He asked. Teaching, I mean, if you're good at it. She considered how honest to be. Then she thought of the deliberate, careful honesty with which he had said you'd rather be anywhere else, and decided he deserved the same. I taught a boy that some people in this town thought didn't belong in a classroom, she said. And the people who made those decisions decided I was more trouble than I was worth. Eli was quiet for a moment. That's not fair, he said. No, it isn't. Did you want to fight them? Yes. She paused. But I didn't have the resources to win that fight. So I chose to survive instead, and try to find somewhere else to be useful. He looked at her steadily. Is this where you'll be useful? She met his gaze. I'm starting to think it might be. It was on the 8th day that Eli took her to the grave. He did not announce where they were going. He simply appeared at the library door after breakfast and said he wanted to show her something on the property, in the tone of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it out before they change their mind. She followed him out through the back of the house, past the kitchen garden buried under snow, past the woodpile, past the edge of the paddock, where 2 horses moved in their slow, patient circles. He walked ahead of her with his hands in his coat pockets, and his shoulders slightly braced the way people walk when they are approaching something that costs them something. The grave was at the far edge of the property on a small rise overlooking the valley. A simple stone marker well maintained, someone kept the area clear of weeds in summer, she could tell, and cleared the snow in winter. The carved letters read, Sarah Eleanor Hale, beloved wife and mother. The dates below told a story in their brevity, a life that had lasted 26 years. Eli stopped in front of it and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, I come here sometimes, when things are confusing. Nora stood beside him. She did not speak. She had learned over 2 years of teaching that there are moments when the most important thing an adult can do for a child is simply remain present without filling the space. The wind moved across the valley below. The snow on the surrounding fields was undisturbed and white. There's something I never told anyone, Eli said. His voice was very careful. The voice of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has decided for reasons they cannot fully articulate that now is the moment. You don't have to tell me, Nora said quietly. I know. A pause. That's why I want to. She waited. The night Mama had Caleb, he said slowly, I prayed. I prayed for a baby brother. I prayed very hard. He stopped, started again. And then she died. And I've been thinking ever since that it was because of me. That my prayer is what? He stopped completely. The valley was very quiet. Nora looked at this boy, this 8-year-old, who had been carrying the weight of his mother's death as a personal debt for 3 years. Who had bent himself into something smaller and harder and more responsible than an 8-year-old should ever have to be, not because of grief alone, but because of guilt. because he had believed with the terrible literalism of a young child's faith that his wanting something had caused a catastrophe. She understood suddenly and completely why he had stopped being a child. He had punished himself for it. She knelt in the snow so that she was at his level. He did not look at her, but he did not step away. "Eli," she said carefully, "your mother was going to have Caleb regardless of what you prayed. That had already happened before you asked for anything. Your prayer didn't cause it. Nothing you did or wanted caused it." He was very still. "Prayers don't work that way," she continued. "The world doesn't work that way. Things happen, terrible things, things that make no sense, and our minds want to find a reason because a reason is easier to live with than the idea that terrible things simply happen without anyone being to blame." She paused. "But you were 5 years old, Eli. You wanted a brother. That is not a sin. That is not something that kills people. It is a 5-year-old wanting a brother." He made a sound, very small, like something cracking somewhere very deep. "I've been so angry," he whispered, "at myself, for so long." "I know." She reached out and put her hand over his hands still in his pockets, but she put her hand over the shape of them through the fabric. "You can put it down now. That anger, it doesn't belong to you." They stood like that for a long time, the two of them at the edge of a snowy field, before a stone marker, while the wind moved through the grasses below, and the sky pressed pale and close overhead. He did not cry. He was Eli Hale, and he had not cried in a very long time, and he was not going to start in front of someone he had known for 8 days. But the thing in his face, the compressed, careful set of it, the way it had been held in place by effort rather than ease, loosened. Just slightly. Just enough. It was Nora thought a beginning. "Does your father know?" she asked when the silence had run its course. "What you've been carrying?" "No." Eli looked at the marker. "Papa has his own things to carry." "He does," Nora agreed. "But I think you might be carrying some of the same weight without knowing it." She paused. "And I think you both might feel better if you knew that." Eli looked at her sideways. "You're going to tell him," he said. "Not unless you want me to." He considered this, looked back at the stone. "Maybe," he said finally. It was she was learning his word for yes. She found the letter on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining, the cold, sleeting kind of rain that Montana produces in December like a personal grievance, and the boys were napping, and Nora had retreated to the library with a cup of tea and a restless feeling she could not name. She had been working her way along the shelves systematically, partly out of genuine interest, and partly because organizing things was how she managed anxiety. She was replacing a volume of Tennyson when she saw it. Not the letter itself, just the corner of an envelope, white tucked between the back of the shelf and the wall, as if it had slid there, accidentally, or had been placed there by someone who needed it out of sight, but could not bear to put it somewhere permanent. She pulled it free carefully. The envelope was unsealed. Inside was several folded sheets of paper in a woman's handwriting. Small, neat, slightly hurried in the later pages. The name on the front in that same handwriting was simply Jonathan. Nora stood very still. She understood immediately what she was holding. She stood there for a long moment with the letter in her hands, the rain moving against the windows, the fire ticking in the grate behind her. She could read it. She was holding it. Sarah had been dead for 3 years, and whatever was in this letter had been sitting unread in a library. Perhaps. Jonathan knew where it was. Perhaps he didn't. and Nora was the mistress of this house now. Technically, contractually, and she had a vested interest in understanding the people she was living with. She could read it. She folded it carefully and put it back exactly where she had found it. Then she sat down in the leather chair and set her tea on the side table and looked at the fire for a very long time. She was thinking about Sarah Hale, a woman she had never met, a woman who had been 26 years old when she died, who had made a terrible and loving choice in the last months of her life and had not told the person that choice would most affect. A woman whose dresses Nora was wearing, whose room she slept in, whose children she was slowly, tentatively beginning to love. A woman who had left a letter that her husband could not bring himself to read. Nora's eyes were wet. She noticed this with some surprise. She pressed her fingers briefly to her face. It was, she thought, an extraordinary thing to cry for someone you had never known, to feel the shape of an absence that was not yours, to grieve a stranger because the people left behind were grieving so visibly that you could not help but understand what had been lost. "May said you'd be in here." She looked up. Eli stood in the doorway in his socks hair slightly rumpled from his nap, watching her with those careful eyes. "Sorry," she said, and realized she meant it. "I was just thinking." He came and sat in the opposite chair without being invited. He looked at her face with the assessing attention of a child who has learned to read adult expressions as a survival skill. "Were you thinking about Mama?" he asked. She was startled. "In a way, yes. How did you know? You have the same face Papa gets sometimes, when he thinks no one's watching," when he pulled his knees up to his chest. "He misses her." "I know. Do you think—" He stopped, started again. "Do you think it's possible to miss someone you never met?" She looked at him, at the careful way he asked it, as if the question were theoretical, as if it were not about him and Caleb and the mother they had lost before they could know her. "Yes," she said. "I think you can miss the idea of someone, the shape of them, the way your life might have been different if they'd been in it." She paused. "I think you can love someone you never met if they left enough of themselves behind to love." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Caleb asks about her sometimes," he said. "What she was like. I tell him things I remember, but I'm worried I'm going to run out of memories, that I'll forget things. Her voice." He looked down at his hands. "I already can't remember exactly what her voice sounded like." Nora felt something tighten in her chest. "Then we should make sure you have other ways to remember her," she said. May knew her well. Charlie knew her. "Your father—" She paused carefully. "Your father loved her deeply. He has memories no one else has. Maybe when he's ready, he can share some of them with you. He doesn't talk about her. I know, but people can change what they're ready for." She looked at him steadily. "Sometimes they just need someone to make it safe." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you're doing?" he asked. "Making it safe." She thought about the letter tucked behind the shelf, about the locked door at the end of the hallway, about Jonathan's face when he said her name with that particular finality. That chapter is closed. "I'm trying to," she said. "I don't know yet if I'm managing it." The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening. Nora had asked May over the course of several evenings small questions about Sarah. Nothing intrusive. Nothing that felt like prying. How she had organized the household. what the boys had been like when she was alive, what kind of things she had enjoyed. It had seemed to Nora a reasonable thing to do to understand the person whose role she had been contracted to fill in the same way you would familiarize yourself with the methods of a teacher whose class you were taking over. She had not been expecting Jonathan to come into the kitchen while she was asking. He was in the doorway before she heard him. He moved quietly for a large man, and the rain had been loud, and he stood there for a moment taking in the scene, May at the stove, Nora at the table, the question she had just asked hanging in the air between them. He said very quietly, "A word, Mrs. Hale." The study. The door closed. Jonathan moved to the window and stood with his back to her, which she recognized as his default position when he was working through something he had not expected to have to work through. "May talks," he said. "Because she cares. I understand that. But I would prefer, your son believes he caused his mother's death." The silence that followed was absolute. Jonathan turned from the window. In the firelight, his face was unreadable, or rather it was working hard to be unreadable and not entirely succeeding. "What did you say?" "Eli. He told me today at the grave." She kept her voice steady, factual. She was telling him something difficult, and she needed him to hear it clearly, not to react to her tone. He was 5 years old when Sarah died. He had prayed for a baby brother. He has spent 3 years believing that his prayer caused her death. Jonathan was very still. He never told me. He's been carrying it alone, along with everything else. She paused. "Jonathan, your son has been punishing himself for 3 years for something that was not his fault. That was not anyone's fault because he was 5 years old, and the world asked him to make sense of something that doesn't make sense." She held his gaze. "He needs to hear from you that it wasn't his fault. Not from me, from you." Something was happening in Jonathan's face. The careful blankness was cracking, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way ice cracks in spring, small lines spreading out from a central point of pressure. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was rough. "I know you didn't. I thought—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had not seen from him before, unguarded, human. "I thought he was just serious, by nature." "He is serious, but not by nature, by necessity." She took a breath. "He made himself serious because he thought he had to be, because he thought he deserved it." Jonathan sat down in his chair, not with his usual deliberate heaviness, but as if his legs had simply decided the floor was where they needed to be. He put his face in his hands. Nora stood across the room and gave him a moment. Outside, the rain continued its cold persistence. The fire settled. "She didn't tell me," he said from behind his hands. His voice was muffled and rougher than she had ever heard it. "That she was in danger. The doctor told me afterward that he'd warned her months before, that there were complications with the pregnancy that made it dangerous. She chose to continue. She chose not to tell me." He lowered his hands. His face was composed again, but the effort was visible. "I didn't know I was going to lose her until I was already losing her." Nora said nothing. She let the words exist in the room. "I've been angry," he said, "for 3 years. At myself, because I should have known, should have made her tell me, should have found a way to—" He stopped. "And at her, for choosing not to tell me, for making that decision without me." He looked at Nora with an expression she had not seen from him before, raw, uncertain, asking something he could not quite formulate into words. "That's a terrible thing to say about someone you love." "It's a human thing," Nora said quietly. "Love doesn't prevent complicated feelings. It just makes them more painful." He looked at her steadily. "There's a letter," he said. "She left a letter. I've never—" He stopped. "I started it once, the first month. I couldn't finish it." He exhaled. I don't know where it is anymore. Nora thought of the envelope tucked behind the Tennyson. She thought of the decision she had made standing in the library with it in her hands. It's in the library, she said, between the shelf and the wall behind the Tennyson. I found it this afternoon. He looked up sharply. I didn't read it, she said. It's yours. The silence stretched between them. In it, something shifted, something small, but real, like a weight redistributed. Why didn't you read it? He asked. She considered this honestly. Because it wasn't mine to read. Whatever she needed to say, she said it to you. That's sacred even if she's gone. She paused. And because I think you need to read it before you can… She stopped herself. Before I can what? She met his gaze. Before you can put down what you've been carrying long enough to pick up something else. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his eyes, complex and unresolved, but not the blankness she had come to expect. You're very perceptive, he said finally. I told you, it's an occupational requirement. He stood, moved toward the door, then stopped his hand on the frame. Eli, he said. I'll speak to him. Tonight, Nora said, gently but without yielding. Don't wait until it's convenient. He turned and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. Not the assessment of those first days. Something more complicated. Something that contained, she thought, the beginning of being seen. Good night, Mrs. Hale, he said. Good night, Jonathan. She heard him cross the hallway, heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, heard him pause at the door of the boys' room, she thought, and then heard a door open softly. She stayed in the study for a long time after that, listening to the rain, not moving toward the door. She was giving them time. She did not know what was said between Jonathan and his son that night. She did not ask the next morning or the morning after. Some things were not hers to know. But she noticed changes. She noticed that at breakfast, Jonathan looked at Eli differently, with a directness he had not had before, as if he were really looking, rather than glancing and looking away. She noticed that Eli, in turn, seemed to carry himself with a fractionally different quality. The relentless composure, still there, still practiced, but with something underneath it that was less like determination and more like relief. She noticed that 2 nights after their conversation, she heard Jonathan's voice in the boys' room after she had come upstairs. Not words, the walls were too thick, but the low, steady cadence of a man reading aloud. A story, she thought, the rhythm of it. When she mentioned this to May the next morning, the housekeeper set down her wooden spoon and pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at the ceiling briefly before looking back at Nora. He hasn't read to them since Sarah died, May said. Not once. Nora picked up her coffee cup. Good, she said. The letter changed things. She knew this because she heard him 2 nights later in the library. She was passing in the hallway when she registered the quality of silence from behind the closed door. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of someone completely still inside it. She did not go in. In the morning, she found him in the kitchen before breakfast, earlier than usual, standing at the window with his coffee, watching the sky lighten over the snow-covered fields. He heard her come in and turned, and she saw immediately that something was different in his face. Not lighter exactly, not healed, but settled. The way a body looks after a fever has finally broken, still exhausted, still marked by what it has been through, but no longer fighting. He looked at her for a moment. She knew, he said. She wrote, she explained why she didn't tell me. She knew I would have tried to stop her. She said, he stopped. She said she chose to have Caleb because she wanted him to exist in the world. And she said she was sorry for not giving me the choice, but she wasn't sorry for the choice itself. He looked down at his coffee. She told me not to. His voice roughened slightly. Not to let grief make me hard. He exhaled. She told me to find someone. When I was ready. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway. The morning light was pale and flat across the linoleum floor. She sounds like she was extraordinary, Nora said quietly. She was. He looked at her steadily. She wrote that I had more love in me than I let myself show. That I needed someone who could see it. He paused. I've been thinking about that. The kitchen was very quiet. From upstairs came the distant sound of Caleb's voice waking. Jonathan, Nora said carefully. Whatever you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything yet. His voice was even. I'm just telling you. He turned back to the window. I thought you should know. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she went to put the kettle on. And he remained at the window, and neither of them said anything more about it. And the morning came in gray and cold, and full of the small, particular sounds of a household beginning its day. 3 days later, the riders came back from the north pasture with news. Charlie arrived in the kitchen before dawn, his face grim in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and asked May quietly to wake the master. Nora was already awake. She slept lightly in an unfamiliar house, and she came downstairs to find Charlie standing at the kitchen table, not looking at anyone in particular. "What's happened?" she asked. Charlie looked at her. He was a man who measured his words, and he measured these carefully. "Cattle missing from the north pasture, near 40 head. He paused. "Tom Briggs is dead. Found him at the fence line. And young Davis, he's alive, but he won't be riding for a while." The cold settled into the kitchen in a way that had nothing to do with the door. Jonathan came downstairs in his work clothes, already awake, as if he had been listening. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and Charlie told him what he had told Nora, and something moved across Jonathan's face. Not grief exactly, but the particular expression of a man who understands that he has just been handed a debt that cannot be repaid. "Tom Briggs was 23 years old, Jonathan said. His voice was very quiet. "He had a wife in Crestwood." "Yes, sir." "Ride to her this morning. Tell her she has this household's full support." He looked at Charlie steadily. "We track them. Already got the boys ready to ride?" "Good." Jonathan turned and found Nora standing at the foot of the stairs. They looked at each other for a moment. "The boys," he said. "I'll handle the boys." She held his gaze. "You come back." It was not a question. It was not quite a request either. It was something in between, something that surprised her by coming out with as much force as it did. Something shifted in Jonathan's expression. "I intend to," he said. He left. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of hooves crossing the yard, receding, fading into the gray pre-dawn quiet. Then she put the kettle on again, because the boys would be awake soon, and they would need breakfast, and she needed something to do with her hands. The day was long, in the particular way that days are long when you are waiting for something you cannot control. She kept the boys occupied. Lessons in the morning, she took them through a map of the river systems of Montana, letting Eli trace the courses with his finger and calculate distances in his head. Caleb spent the better part of an hour transferring dried beans from one bowl to another and calling it counting, which was, as far as Nora was concerned, entirely legitimate mathematics. She answered Eli's questions about where his father had gone with the measured honesty she had decided to extend him from the beginning. There was trouble with some of the cattle his father was handling it. He would be back. "Is it dangerous?" Eli asked. "Your father is experienced, and he has good men with him," Nora said. "He'll be careful." Eli looked at her with those eyes that saw more than 8-year-olds should. "You're worried," he said. She did not lie to him. "I'm concerned. That's different. Concerned means I care what happens. It doesn't mean I think something will go wrong. Mama used to worry when Papa rode out," he said. "I remember that." "It's a reasonable thing to feel," Nora said. "It means someone matters to you." He looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, "Does Papa matter to you?" She considered the honest answer to this question. "He's my husband," she said carefully. "And your father. And I've seen—" She paused. "I've seen enough of him to know that he matters." "Yes." Eli nodded, as if this confirmed something he had been evaluating. He went back to his maps, but Nora noticed that he did not wander to the window to look for his father's return until after dark, when she had already been watching it for several hours. Charlie brought word at midday that the riders had tracked the cattle northeast and were in pursuit. No further casualties. No further news. By evening, there was still nothing. Nora put the boys to bed with extra stories. Caleb demanded 3, which was one more than usual, and she gave him 3 without argument. Eli accepted the kiss on the forehead she had begun offering, without making it a question. The way she had learned was the right approach with a child who needed affection, but needed to maintain the dignity of receiving it on his own terms. She came downstairs and sat in the parlor and did not try to read. May sat with her for an hour knitting and did not try to make conversation. It was, Nora thought, one of the most companionable hours she had spent since arriving at Hale Ranch. At some point she said, "I barely know him." May did not look up from her knitting. "We've been married 2 weeks. We've had perhaps 4 conversations that weren't about household logistics or the boys." So this," she gestured vaguely at the feeling she could not name, the one that had been sitting in her chest since the riders left before dawn. "This is disproportionate." May put down her knitting and looked at Nora with the level gaze of a woman who has been watching people for 40 years and has long since stopped being surprised by them. "Miss Nora," she said, "the length of time you've known someone has very little to do with how much they matter to you. You know that. You're a teacher. You've had students for 1 week who you'd have walked through fire for." Nora was quiet. "The question isn't how long you've known him," May continued. "The question is what you've seen of him. And you've seen," she paused, "you've seen him love his sons even when he didn't know how to show them. You've seen him tell the truth when he could have been kinder and lied. You've seen him read a letter he'd been afraid to read for 3 years because you told him he needed to." She picked up her knitting again. "That's not nothing." "No," Nora agreed softly. "It's not nothing." She was still sitting in the parlor at 11 o'clock when she heard hoofbeats outside. She was at the window before the thought formed. Standing there with her hand on the curtain, looking out at the dark yard, watching the lanterns of the returning riders appear at the gate one by one. She counted them, the way you count such things, not yet knowing which number she was waiting for. She saw him when the group reached the yard. His distinctive silhouette in the saddle, she had already learned his silhouette. She realized which was a thing that happened before you were aware of it happening, and the way he sat slightly off-center, favoring his left side, in a way he hadn't before they left. She had her coat over her shoulders and was across the yard before she had consciously decided to go. "You're hurt," she said, reaching him as he dismounted. "It's nothing." He moved stiffly, one hand pressed briefly to his side. "Grazed. We got most of the cattle back. The men who took them." His voice went somewhere dark and even. "They won't trouble anyone again." She looked at his side. In the lantern light, she could see the dark stain on his shirt. "Jonathan Hale," she said, and she heard the steel in her own voice with some surprise. "You are going to come inside right now and let me clean that wound. Or so help me, I will drag you. Your sons have been worried all day. The least you can do is not die of an infection out of sheer stubbornness." Charlie beside them coughed into his fist. Jonathan looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has surprised him, not the assessing look, not the careful blankness, but something more direct and less defended. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She cleaned the wound at the kitchen table while May boiled water, and Jonathan sat with the particular contained patience of a man who is in more pain than he is admitting to. The cut was a furrow across his ribs, not deep, but bloody and mean. The kind of wound that would hurt considerably more tomorrow than it hurt tonight. "Who did this?" she asked, working as gently as she could with the cloth. "One of the men we cornered." His jaw tightened as she pressed. "They chose to fight." "Tom Briggs," she said quietly. "He was 23. "I know." His voice was rough. "He rode for me for 2 years. His wife is expecting their first child in the spring." A pause. "Charlie's already sent word." She worked in silence for a moment. "It's not your fault," she said. "What happened to him? I employ those men. I put them in the path of, you gave him a job, you gave him wages and a roof and work he was good at." She looked up from the wound, met his eyes directly. "You don't get to claim only the bad things that follow from that. The morning he rode out to protect your cattle, he was also riding out because this place and this work mattered to him. That's yours too. Both things are." Jonathan looked at her. Something in his face, that slow, reluctant quality of a man who is being reached despite himself. "You have a way," he said, "of making arguments it's difficult to counter." "I had several years of practice." She went back to bandaging. "You'll rest tomorrow." "I have." "You'll rest." She tied off the bandage with slightly more firmness than was strictly necessary. "Your sons need you alive and functional. Charlie is entirely capable of managing for 1 day." Jonathan caught her hand as she reached for the medical kit, not roughly, carefully the way you stop someone when you have something to say and need them to hear it. Nora. Her name in his mouth. He had used it only a handful of times, and each time it landed differently than she expected. Not formal, not distant, not the flat contractual address she had steeled herself against. Something more careful than that. Something that held attention. "Thank you," he said. "For waiting, for being." He stopped. Started again. "The boys." "The boys are fine," she said. "They were worried, but they were brave." "They were brave because you were with them." She did not say anything to that. His thumb moved across the back of her hand, a small motion absent the kind of thing a person does when their body is ahead of their intention. And then he seemed to register what he was doing and released her hand and looked away. "Rest," she said, when she had found her voice. "Yes," he said quietly. "Good night, Nora." She gathered the bandaging and the medical kit and went to put them away, and stood for a moment in the stillness of the back room, with her hands pressed flat on the shelf, breathing carefully, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. May appeared in the doorway with an expression that contained a volume of commentary she was visibly restraining. "Not a word," Nora said. "I wasn't going to say a thing," May said serenely, and went back to the kitchen. The night Eli told her the rest of it, she was not expecting it. She had been in the room she still thought of as Sarah's room. She was beginning tentatively to think of it as hers, a process she was allowing to proceed at its own pace, and she had fallen asleep over a book and woken to the sound of a small voice from the direction of the connecting sitting room. She thought at first it was Caleb. Caleb had nightmares. Occasionally, the ordinary nightmares of 3-year-olds, and May had warned her that he sometimes wandered. But when she opened the door, it was Eli she found sitting on the daybed in the sitting room in his nightshirt, his knees to his chest, his eyes open and very bright with recent crying, though he had clearly already made the decision not to be caught crying. "Bad dream?" she asked gently. He shook his head, hesitated. "Then I heard Papa." She sat beside him on the daybed. "What do you mean?" "I woke up and I heard him. In his room." He looked at his hands. "He was crying." She was still. "I heard him once before," Eli said quietly. "The night Mama died. I was little. I didn't really understand what was happening. But I heard him through the wall saying, 'It was my fault. It was my fault.' Over and over." He looked at Nora. "I didn't tell you that part. Before, at the grave. I told you about my prayer, but I didn't tell you I've been thinking ever since that night that Papa thought it was his fault too, and we've both just been carrying it, each thinking we were the reason." He stopped, and neither of us ever said. Nora sat with this for a moment. The house was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the window glass. She thought about what it meant, a father and a son in rooms separated by a wall, each privately holding the same guilt, each protecting the other from it, in the way that people sometimes protect each other from things, by never speaking of them at all. "Eli," she said, "tomorrow I need you to tell your father what you told me, not what I told you about the prayer and the guilt. I mean, tell him, in your own words, because he needs to hear it from you." She paused. "And you need to hear what he says back." Eli was quiet for a long time. "What if he's angry?" he said finally. "He won't be angry." She was certain of this in a way she could not fully explain, except that she had spent the past 2 weeks watching Jonathan Hale's relationship with his sons, the fierce, painful, imperfect love he carried for them, and she knew its shape. "He loves you more than anything in this world. When he understands what you've been carrying, he won't be angry. He'll be broken open, and then he'll be able to start mending." Eli looked at her. "How do you know so much about people?" he asked. She thought of 2 years in a one-room schoolhouse, of learning to read a room full of children, what they needed, what they feared, what they were trying not to show. Of Richard, who she had misjudged entirely because she had been too busy wanting him to love her to see who he actually was. Of herself in that same process of learning. "I've made a lot of mistakes," she said. "Mistakes teach you things about people if you pay attention." Eli considered this with his habitual seriousness. "I like the way you teach," he said finally. It was the most direct thing he had said to her that was not also a challenge or an observation. It was simply plainly a gift. "Thank you," she said. "I think—" He stopped, started again with the careful deliberateness of someone saying something they have thought about for a while. "I think I'm glad you came here." She put her arm around him and he leaned into her side, and this time he didn't pull away after a few seconds. This time, he stayed. "Me too," she said softly. They sat together in the sitting room while the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet. And after a while, Nora began to tell him a story, not from a book but one she made up, as she went about a boy who thought he carried the weight of a mountain, and discovered one day that it had been shared all along. He was asleep before the end of it. She carried him back to his room and tucked him in, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his face in the dark, the composed set of it already loosened by sleep, so that he looked finally like what he was, a child. Then she went back to her room and lay in the dark, and thought about what she was building here, what she was becoming. And in the morning, Eli went to his father. She did not hear what passed between them. She was in the library, deliberately occupied, keeping the distance that the moment required. But at lunch, she looked across the table and saw Jonathan's hand resting on Eli's shoulder, a simple, steady presence, and saw the way Eli sat differently than he had before. Less braced, less armored. More like a boy who has been told finally that the weight he has been carrying was never truly his. She looked at her plate. She felt May watching her from the kitchen doorway. She did not look up because she was fairly certain that if she did, she would cry in front of everyone, and she had decided some time ago that she was not going to do that. She concentrated on her soup. She realized with the particular clarity of someone who has arrived at a truth by a very roundabout route, no longer simply surviving. She was tentatively, unmistakably beginning to live. February came in cold and still, the way February always does in Montana. Not with the dramatic violence of January, but with a quiet, settled determination, as if the cold had stopped trying to prove anything and had simply decided to stay. The ranch moved with it. The rhythms of winter work, feed runs to the north pasture before dawn. Fence line checks the constant management of animals and equipment in temperatures that made everything take twice as long and cost twice as much effort. Jonathan was up before light every morning and back after dark most evenings, and the house arranged itself around this pattern, the way houses do around the people who live in them. But something had changed. It was not one large change. It was a series of small ones, the way a river changes its course not all at once, not dramatically, but through the persistent pressure of water against stone over time. He came to dinner now, not every evening, not without the occasional disappearance into the study for paperwork that could not wait, but most evenings. He sat at the table, and he asked the boys about their day. Really asked, not the perfunctory asking of a man who has been told he should, but the actual asking of someone who wants to know the answer. He listened when Eli described the campaign routes of Alexander the Great with the intensity of a small general. He let Caleb show him the drawing he had made of a horse with 6 legs, because Caleb explained with perfect logic that way it would be faster. He read to them at night. This had become, in the space of 2 weeks, a fixed point around which the rest of the household organized itself. May's dishes done earlier, so the kitchen was quiet. Nora finishing her own reading so she could hear the low cadence of his voice from the hallway, if she passed the particular quality of the boys' silence as they listened. She had not anticipated how much that sound would come to mean to her. The sound of a man learning slowly and painfully, and with enormous effort to be present in his own life. She kept a careful distance from this process. She understood that the changes Jonathan was making were his to make at his own pace, and that her role was not to accelerate them, but to make the space for them possible. She did not push. She did not lean toward him. She held the household steady and kept the boys learning, and let the warmth she was building in the house speak for itself. She was, she told herself, doing exactly what she had contracted to do. She was also, she acknowledged privately, and with some resignation, entirely failing at not caring about what happened next. She saw the figure on the ridge on a Tuesday. She had taken the boys outside for their afternoon exercise. Nora had instituted this firmly in the second week over May's gentle protest that it was too cold, children needed fresh air, and fresh air needed to be cold in February, or it wasn't doing anyone any good. They were in the side yard, Caleb attempting to build something he described as a snow horse, but which resembled more of a snow boulder, and Eli helping with the structural components while maintaining careful deniability about how much he was enjoying himself. Nora was watching them, half her attention on Caleb's architectural ambitions and half on the book she was failing to read, when she glanced up and saw it. A figure still and dark on the ridge to the east, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, standing at the edge of the tree line, not moving, watching. She looked for perhaps 3 seconds. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She stood very still for a moment, her book closed in her hands. "Inside," she said. Casually, without urgency in the tone she used when redirecting children away from something, without wanting them to know they were being redirected. "But the horse isn't finished," Caleb protested. "We'll finish it tomorrow. The horse needs to rest." She brought them in through the kitchen and told May to make hot chocolate, which eliminated all the further protest instantly. And then she went to find Charlie. He was in the barn examining a piece of tack with the methodical attention of a man who takes equipment seriously. "Charlie," she said. There was someone on the east ridge, about quarter-mile out at the tree line, standing still, watching the yard. Charlie looked up at her. His expression did not change, but his hands went still on the leather strap. "How long?" he asked. "I only saw him for a moment, but he'd been there long enough to be watching, not just passing." She paused. "Could be nothing." "Could be," Charlie agreed in a tone that suggested he did not think it was nothing. "The cattle raid," she said. "The men who got away." Charlie set down the tack. "I'll have a look at the ridge, and I'll have a word with the boss when he's back." He looked at her steadily. "You were right to tell me, Ms. Hale, and right to bring the boys in." She nodded. Walking back to the house, she did not look at the ridge again. She had learned in 2 years of managing a classroom full of children who could smell fear the way animals can, that the appearance of calm was itself a form of protection. But her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She did not tell Jonathan that evening. She told herself this was because Charlie would handle. It would investigate, would inform Jonathan. If it warranted his attention, would manage the security of the ranch, as he always managed everything efficiently and without drama. She told herself her role was the household, the boys, the domestic sphere that Jonathan had contracted her to oversee. She told herself these things, and knew underneath them that the real reason she did not tell him was that she did not want to see the expression she had learned to read in his face when something threatened what he loved. The particular quality of Jonathan Hale's concern, the way it went cold and hard, and terrifyingly focused, because she had realized in watching it that she recognized it, that something in her responded to it, that she had begun to care not just about whether he was safe, but about whether he was all right, and she was not ready to examine what that meant. So she said nothing and helped Caleb build a more structurally sound snow horse the following afternoon, and checked the east ridge with her peripheral vision every few minutes and did not see the figure again. Charlie reported to Jonathan 2 days later. She knew this because Jonathan came to find her in the library that evening, with his jaw set and his eyes doing the cold, focused thing. "Charlie told me what you saw," he said. "I didn't want to alarm you without more information. I would prefer," he said quietly, and without particular inflection, "that you tell me these things directly, not through Charlie, not through May." He held her gaze. "If something concerns you about the safety of this property, of this family, I need to know it." She looked at him. "I understand," she said. The man Charlie found tracks on the east ridge, 2 sets of boots. They'd been there at least twice. He paused. "There are men unaccounted for from the cattle raid. We believe there are 2. Jake Mason," she said. She had heard the name in Charlie's report to Jonathan after the raid had filed it away the way she filed most things. Jonathan looked at her slightly differently. "You know that name?" "I listened to Charlie's report. I thought it might be relevant." She kept her voice even. "He worked here once. Before. You dismissed him. 4 years ago. For theft." His expression was carefully neutral. "I did not think he would. Men who feel they have nothing left to lose are capable of more than you expect," Nora said. "I've seen it. Not violence, but the same quality of feeling. The kind that doesn't give up, because giving up would require caring about the future, and they've stopped caring about the future." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to increase the night watches," he said. "I want you to know that the house is covered. Charlie will have men at the perimeter. And if something happens anyway, it won't." "Jonathan," she looked at him steadily, "if something happens anyway, I need to know where the boys should go. What they should do." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the instinct to say, "It won't come to that," against the practical recognition that she was right to ask. "The wardrobe in the boys' room," he said finally. "It's against an exterior wall, but it's solid, reinforced. They can fit inside with room to breathe." He paused. "And the trellis outside their window. Eli is old enough to climb it. He could get Caleb to the bunkhouse." "Good," she said. "Tell Eli. Not to frighten him. Tell him, as you'd tell a young man who needs to be prepared. He'll receive it better that way." Jonathan looked at her with the expression she had begun to associate with moments when she had said something that landed somewhere he didn't expect. "You know him well," he said. "I'm learning him." She paused. "He's worth knowing." Something in Jonathan's face moved that slow, reluctant softening that she had stopped trying to predict and had started simply watching for the way you watch for certain birds in winter. Rarely briefly worth the waiting. "Yes," he said quietly. "He is." She had almost convinced herself it was going to be all right. This was, she would think later, the nature of the thing. The way safety becomes assumption. The way the absence of danger starts to feel like its permanent absence, rather than simply its temporary delay. 3 weeks had passed since the figure on the ridge. The night watches continued. Nothing happened. The ranch settled back into its rhythms. She almost convinced herself. The night Mason came, it was the 3rd week of February, and the temperature had dropped below anything the month had previously attempted. The kind of cold that made the house creak and settle around them, like a living thing, seeking warmth. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when she heard it. Not a dramatic sound. Not glass breaking, or voices, or anything that announced itself as danger. What woke her was simply the wrong quality of silence. The way silence can suddenly feel occupied, the way a room that should be empty sounds different when it isn't. She lay still for 5 seconds. Then she was out of bed and at the door before she had made a conscious decision. The hallway was dark. She could hear nothing from below. She moved to the boys' room first. Her feet silent on the floorboards, she had learned by now, the ones that creaked and the ones that didn't, and opened the door. Both boys asleep. Caleb making the small, soft sounds he made in deep sleep. Eli still on his side, breathing. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she heard the sound from below, the particular sound of a door opening that should not open. Not the main door, the kitchen entrance. The one that the ranch hands used in the mornings that was latched from the inside, that someone who had worked here for 4 years would know how to force. She went to Jonathan's door. She did not knock. She opened it and said in the quietest possible voice that still carried, "Someone's in the house." He was already awake, already sitting up, already reaching for the pistol on the nightstand, with the efficiency of a man who has been sleeping with one part of his attention on the possibility of this. "The boys," he said in the same register, "asleep. I'm going to wake Eli. Go." He was already moving, pulling on trousers, checking the chamber. "Stay together. Don't come downstairs." She did not argue. There was no time to argue. She went back to the boys' room and closed the door behind her. Eli woke the moment her hand touched his shoulder. He always slept lightly, this boy. And he looked at her face and understood immediately that something was wrong. "Eli," she said very quietly, "I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I tell you." His eyes were wide, but his expression was steadying the way she had watched it steady over the past weeks, the old habit of self-possession, which she had spent considerable effort trying to help him set down, now serving its proper purpose. "There are men downstairs," she said. "Men who want to hurt your father and us." She kept her voice level. "I need you to take Caleb." She was already lifting the still sleeping Caleb, pressing him into Eli's arms. "And go out the window, the trellis, down to the bunkhouse. Get Charlie. Don't stop. Don't look back. Do you understand?" "What about you?" Eli said. "I'll be right behind you." The look he gave her, 8 years old, fully awake, entirely serious, told her he understood she was not telling him the complete truth. But he looked down at Caleb in his arms. He looked back at her. And he made the choice that she was asking him to make because he understood it was the right one. "Be careful," he said. "Always." She kissed his forehead quickly. "Go." She helped him to the window, watched him work the sash up carefully, quietly, Caleb beginning to stir and mumble, watched him swing one leg over the sill, find the trellis with his foot, test it. "Eli," he looked back at her, "your mother would be proud of you." His face did something complicated, and then smoothed. He nodded once, turned, and went down the side of the house into the dark, with his brother in his arms, and Nora watched them go, and then turned back to the room. Below her, something broke. Glass, she thought. And then, voices, men's voices, loud, not bothering to be quiet anymore. She looked around the room quickly. The fireplace poker was in the boys' room. She had relocated it there 2 weeks ago for reasons she had not examined carefully at the time, but which she now understood had been instinct. She picked it up and moved to the hallway door and opened it and listened. Downstairs, at least 4 voices, the heavy tread of multiple men moving through the rooms below. Something falling, the vase she had placed on the dining table maybe. And Jonathan's voice, steady, cold, carrying an authority she recognized. "Put the knife down, Mason. Your argument is with me." A laugh, rough and unpleasant. "Oh, we'll get to you, Hale. We'll get to you. But first we're going to make sure you understand what it costs to throw a man away like he's nothing." She moved to the top of the stairs and looked down. The parlor was lit by the lamps Jonathan had lit when he came downstairs, and in the light she could see them 5 men, 2 ransacking the room with the methodical efficiency of people who have done this before. 1 holding May, who was in her nightdress, and looked furious rather than frightened, which Nora found both alarming and deeply characteristic. 1 covering Jonathan with a pistol from the far side of the room, and Jake Mason himself in the center of the room, looking up at the stairs. Looking up at her. He was not what she had expected. Not a large man, not particularly menacing in appearance, middle height, angular, with the particular gauntness of someone who has been living rough for weeks. But his eyes had the quality she recognized, and had described to Jonathan the quality of a man who has stopped thinking about consequences because he has stopped believing he has a future worth protecting. "There she is," he said without raising his voice. "The school teacher. Come down and join us." He gestured to 2 of the men. They started toward the stairs. Nora did not move back. She held her position at the top of the stairs, and she looked at Mason, and she thought about what she knew about him, not much, but what there was. 4 years working this ranch, dismissed for theft. A brother who had ridden with cattle thieves and been killed by the men pursuing them. A man who had walked away from everything twice and both times landed here. At this house. At this family. "You worked here," she said loudly enough for the room. The 2 men on the stairs slowed slightly. 4 years. You know this house." "That's right," Mason said. He was watching her with the wariness of someone assessing an unpredictable element. "Then you know those boys," she said. "You know Eli. You've seen him grow up." She held his gaze. "He's 8 years old. He has done nothing to you. Nothing." Something moved in Mason's face, brief, quickly suppressed. "I'm not here for the boys," he said. "No," she said. "You're here for Jonathan. But what happens to those boys if you take their father from them is the same thing that happened to you when your brother died." She held his gaze without flinching. "You know what that feels like. I am asking you not to put that on them." The room was very quiet for a moment. It was, she would think later, never going to be enough. Mason had come too far down a particular road to turn back on a single appeal. She had known that, even as she made it. But the seconds it bought, the slight hesitation, the fractional redirection of attention in the room, were seconds Jonathan could use. She saw him move in her peripheral vision. What happened next happened very fast. Jonathan crossed the room in 2 strides toward the man, covering him with a pistol, not away from him. Toward him, which was the last thing the man expected, and the gun went off and missed. And then Jonathan had the man's wrist, and the struggle was brief and decisive. May, with the presence of mind that Nora had come to understand, was simply May's baseline state. In a crisis, drove her elbow into the kidney of the man holding her and freed herself while he was still processing what had happened. Nora came down the stairs. The 2 men who had been coming up turned at the noise below them, and she swung the poker at the closer one, with the full body commitment of someone who has been a schoolteacher long enough to know that hesitation in a critical moment accomplishes nothing useful. She caught him across the shoulder. He went sideways. The second one grabbed for her arm, and she twisted, ducking under his reach, the way her body had apparently decided to do without consulting her, and drove the poker butt into his midsection. "The children!" Mason shouted. "Where are the—" "Gone," Nora said. "They're gone. Mason, they're safe, and there is nothing left here worth what you're going to lose for it." He looked at her. There was something in his face, not surrender, not quite, but the first fracture in the absolute certainty of someone who has been running on pure intention for weeks and has not yet had to face the moment when intention meets reality. Jonathan's voice cut through the room. "Mason." Mason turned. He looked at Jonathan at the pistol Jonathan now held at the two men on the floor at May, standing free and furious by the fireplace at the stairs, where two of his men had been stopped by a woman with a fireplace poker. And he calculated something quickly, the way men calculate, when they understand that the situation has changed. He ran. The remaining man followed him through the back of the house, and then the kitchen door banged open, and there were footsteps across the yard, and then nothing. The room settled. Jonathan moved to Nora immediately. He checked her face, her arms, her hands, the quick clinical assessment of someone who needs to establish damage before they can allow themselves to feel anything. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at him. "You?" "No." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had stopped trying to predict. "The boys. I sent them to the bunkhouse. Eli took Caleb down the trellis." She paused. "He was remarkable." Something in Jonathan's face broke open briefly, like light through a crack. "Good. That's—" He stopped. "Good." Charlie arrived with 6 ranch hands through the front door 20 seconds later, which was, as Nora reflected, considerably less timely than dramatic. But the timing of rescue rarely cooperates with narrative. "Boss," Charlie took in the room. "We heard the shot. We were—" "Mason and one other went out the back," Jonathan said. "Take the men and find them. I want them alive if that's possible." Charlie nodded and was already turning. At the doorway, he paused and looked at Nora. "Well done, Mrs. Hale," he said simply. Then he was gone, and Jonathan was looking at her. And the room, the damaged, ransacked, lamp-lit room, was suddenly very quiet. The boys came back with Charlie's second, a steady young man named Walker, who had found them at the bunkhouse door and understood immediately that the right thing to do was bring them home. Caleb was fully awake and crying with the focused intensity of a 3-year-old who has been frightened and is now safe and is experiencing those two things simultaneously. Eli was not crying. He had the particular stillness of someone who has been very frightened and is now choosing very deliberately to hold it together. He looked at Nora when he came through the door, and she went to him and put her arms around him and felt the moment when the holding together failed, when the breath he let out was the one that had been held since he went out the window into the cold dark with his brother. And he held on to her with both hands and shook just once, the way a building shakes in an earthquake, briefly, thoroughly, down to its foundations. "I've got you," she said. "You did everything right. Both of you were exactly right." Jonathan was there a moment later, kneeling on the floor of the hallway, with one arm around each of his sons, and Nora stepped back to give them space and watched the 3 of them. This man and these boys, this complicated, grieving, slowly mending family, hold each other in the aftermath of the thing that had tried to break them. She stepped back and stood in the doorway to the parlor and pressed her hands flat against the doorframe and breathed. May appeared beside her with a blanket that she draped around Nora's shoulders without comment. "Thank you," Nora said quietly. "You kept your head," May said, "when it counted." "I was terrified." "I know." May's voice was matter-of-fact. "That's what makes it mean something." Charlie found Mason and his man 3 miles east in a hollow by the creek bed, where they had apparently decided to wait out the night and reassess their options. Jonathan received this information at dawn, standing on the porch with his coffee, and Nora was beside him when Charlie delivered it. She heard what Charlie did not say directly, understood it from the way he stood, and the way Jonathan's jaw set, and the brief, silent exchange that passed between two men who have managed difficult things together for a long time. "The men who died in the cattle raid," Jonathan said. "Tom Briggs, and young Davis, who'll carry that wound the rest of his life." He looked at Charlie. "Justice here looks different than it does in a courtroom." "Yes, sir," Charlie said. "Make it quick," Jonathan said. "Whatever it is, make it quick." Charlie nodded and left. Nora stood beside Jonathan on the porch as the sun came up pale and cold and absolute across the white fields, and did not say anything. She understood what had just been decided. She understood that this was the frontier, and that the frontier had its own accounting, and that a man who had killed and would kill again in order to reach the children in this house had made his own calculation before she ever made hers. She thought of Mason's face in the parlor, the fracture she had seen there, brief and quickly gone. She had meant what she said to him about the boys. She had meant it in the moment, and she meant it now. But she also meant this. The people standing on this porch in this cold morning light were alive, all of them. And some decisions made on behalf of the people you love, you carry quietly. Jonathan looked at her. She looked back. The sun continued to rise. After a long time, he said, "I need to say something to you." "All right." He set down his coffee cup on the porch railing. He turned toward her slightly. The expression on his face was the least offended she had ever seen at all. The careful management of it set aside the way you set aside something you've been carrying when you finally decide you're done carrying it. "I wrote your name down," he said, "before you arrived. Charlie had told me about what happened in Crestwood, about the school board, about Cole. I'd been thinking about—" He stopped. "I'd been thinking for some time that something needed to change. For the boys. For—" He stopped again. "For me." He looked at her directly. "When Charlie told me about you, I had a feeling. I don't put much stock in feelings as a rule, but I had one. And I wrote your name down. And I wrote that you would stay. Because something in the account of what you'd done standing on a principle you knew would cost you everything made me think you were the kind of person who stays." "You couldn't have known that," she said quietly. "No, I couldn't." He held her gaze. "I was right anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Jonathan, I'm not finished." He exhaled. "I told you when you arrived that I was not capable of love, that chapter was closed. I believe I was telling you the truth as I understood it at the time." A pause. "I no longer understand it that way." The porch was very cold. The fields beyond the fence glittered under the new sun. "What I feel." He seemed to be choosing each word with the particular care of a man who does not trust himself, with imprecision, when something important is at stake. "What I feel for you is not what I felt for Sarah. It is not the same shape. I don't think it's supposed to be." He looked at her. "But it is. It is real. It is specific to you, to who you are and what you've done here and who you've been to my sons." He paused. "And last night, watching you in that room, watching you speak to Mason, watching you choose to fight for this family." Something moved in his expression, deep and unguarded. I understood something. That what began as a transaction has become something I would not lose for any consideration. Nora's hands holding the blanket around her shoulders tightened. "You don't have to say this," she said. Her voice was steady, which was something she would later be proud of, because the rest of her was not steady at all. "You don't owe me. This is not about debt," he said. "This is about—" He stopped. looked at her. Nora, I am asking you, not because of a contract, not because of the year we agreed to. I am asking you if you are willing to try, to let this be what it seems to be becoming. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. In his palm was a key. She recognized it immediately. The key to the locked room. The master bedroom. Sarah's room. The room that had been sealed for 3 years. The key he had given her the night of the cattle raid that she had held all night and returned unused. I unlocked it this morning, he said. I went inside. A pause. The letter, when I read it, she said to make it a home again. She said to let someone in. He looked at the key in his hand, then back at her. I think I'm finally ready to do that. She looked at the key. She looked at him. She thought about the woman she had been 3 weeks ago, frozen at a fence post, out of options, accepting the least terrible available alternative and calling it survival. She thought about Richard, who had needed someone whose life wasn't always on fire. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere, not because you had nowhere to go, but because it was where you wanted to be. She reached out and took the key. It was warm from his pocket. It was small and heavy, and it fit perfectly in her hand. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not in a year. Not after. She looked at him steadily. But I want you to understand, I'm not staying because of a contract. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. She paused. I'm staying because I choose to. Because these boys are mine now, whatever the law says. And because... She stopped. Because whatever this is between us, Jonathan, I want to know what it becomes. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had been watching for since the beginning. Not assessed, not managed, not defended. Seen. Then he reached out and covered her hand with his, her hand still holding the key, his hand over it, the way you hold something you want to make sure doesn't fall. Then stay, he said quietly. The sun came fully over the ridge, and the whole valley lit up white and gold, and they stood on the porch of a house that was becoming a home, and stayed. The community came 3 days later. Nora was in the kitchen when May came to find her wiping her hands on her apron, with the expression of someone who has looked out a window and is not sure yet whether what they've seen is good news or complicated news. Riders, May said, and wagons, several. Nora went to the window. A line of vehicles and horses was coming up the road from the direction of Crestwood families. She recognized neighbors she had seen at a distance, and in the middle of it, the unmistakable bulk of Edgar Wells's wagon. Jonathan was already on the porch when she came outside. He stood with his arms folded watching the procession approach with an expression of measured reserve. Do you know what this is? She asked. News travels, he said. This valley talks. Edgar Wells climbed down from his wagon first. He had the look of a man who has spent several days working up to something and is now committed to seeing it through. Mr. Hale, he said. Mrs. Hale. He looked at Nora with the particular discomfort of someone who owes a debt they are not certain how to repay. We heard what happened. We wanted to make sure the family was all right. We're well, Jonathan said. Thank you for coming. From the other wagons, people were climbing down with baskets and boxes food, Nora realized. Supplies. Mrs. Patterson, with her practical arms full of clean linens. Mr. Chen from the general store, with a crate of things that would take weeks to use. Other families, some of whose names she did not yet know, carrying the particular offerings that frontier communities carry to each other after a crisis, food and labor, and the quiet acknowledgement that bad things happen, and the response to bad things is to show up. Harden Cole's wife was there too. Nora noticed this and said nothing. Wells cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "the school board has been some discussion since the incident about the decisions we made in November." He was not meeting her eyes. "We acted poorly. The board's several members feel that we acted poorly, that the situation with the Crenshaw boy was handled, that you were treated unfairly." Nora waited. "We'd like to offer you your position back," Wells said. "The school, if you're willing. We understand if—" "Mr. Wells," Nora said. He looked at her. "I appreciate that. I understand what it takes for you to say it, and I mean that genuinely." She paused. "But I have a family now. I have sons who need teaching, and I've started a small school here on the ranch for children from the neighboring farms." She looked at him steadily. "If the board is serious about doing better about what a school in this valley should stand for, then I'd suggest they think about that directly. Not about whether I'm available, but about what they want to build." Wells looked at her for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. Not with relief, with something closer to respect. "That's fair," he said. Silas Garrett was there, the man whose complaint about his son Thomas had begun the chain of events that had sent Nora into the storm. He had been standing at the edge of the gathering, and she had been aware of him without looking at him directly, the way you are aware of a thing you're not sure how to approach. She had not expected what happened next. He walked past her. He walked to where his son Thomas was standing. Thomas, who was 14 now, broad-shouldered with his father's build, but his mother's uncertain eyes, and he put his hand on the boy's arm. And he said loud enough for the people near them to hear, "I was wrong. About the school. About what I said to your teacher." He looked at his son. "You have a right to learn whatever will serve you. That's what school is for. I should have understood that from the beginning." Thomas looked at his father with the expression of a boy who has been waiting for something for a long time and is not quite certain he is receiving it correctly. Then the boy nodded slowly. "Thank you, Pa," he said. Nora looked away. She looked at Jonathan, who was watching the same scene, and their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his face what she felt. In her own, the particular emotion of watching something repair itself, small and imperfect, and real. The men and women of the valley worked through the afternoon. Windows were repaired. The parlor was put back together. Food appeared in the kitchen in quantities that would last weeks. Children ran between the legs of the adults and discovered the snow horse in the side yard still standing. Eli having repaired the structural damage from the week's weather, and immediately began improving it until it had taken on a life well beyond anything Caleb had originally intended. Jonathan moved through it all with the ease of a man on his own ground, talking to the ranchers, directing the labor, managing the particular diplomacy of a community that is putting something right. He was good at this, she noticed, better than the cold, closed man of their first evening might have suggested. He had been, she thought, always capable of this. He had simply stopped doing it. Late in the afternoon, she found him for a moment alone by the paddock fence watching the fields. "This is what it used to be like," he said when she came to stand beside him. "When Sarah was alive, the ranch had people came here. She made it a place people wanted to come to." "They came today," Nora said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Because of you. Because of what you did." He paused. "Because of who you are in this valley, whether you know it yet or not." She looked at the fields, at the snow and the pale winter sun, and the sounds of people behind them working and talking, filling the yard with the sound of a household that is no longer empty. "I want to do something," she said. "What?" "A proper wedding." She turned to look at him. "Not what we did in the study with the judge. A real one, in front of people. Because She stopped, tried to find the right words. Because I want there to be a moment that is ours, that we chose, not a transaction, a choice made in front of everyone who matters. Jonathan looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said simply. We'll need to plan. Yes to all of it, he said. Whatever you want. Something moved in his face, that smile she had first seen as the edges of a thing, and now saw fully. Whatever makes it feel real to you. Yes. She looked at him. At this man who had been 3 weeks ago, an unknown, a name on a gate, a cold transaction, a locked door. It already feels real, she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand there, by the paddock fence in front of whoever might be watching, and held it. Good, he said. The wedding was planned for late April, when the last of the winter had finally relented and the valley had remembered how to be green. In the weeks between, the house continued its transformation. Nora opened the locked room. Not alone with Jonathan in an evening when the boys were asleep, and May had gone to her own quarters, and the house was quiet, and theirs. He unlocked it, and they went in together. And it was what she had imagined it would be, preserved or persistinated with someone who was no longer there. They spent the evening in that room together. Jonathan told her about Sarah, not the way he had spoken of her before in the flat, declarative sentences of someone reciting facts at a safe distance, but properly. With warmth and grief and the full, complicated texture of someone who had loved and was now slowly learning to hold both things at once. He told her about Sarah's laugh, about the way she could make any room feel warmer simply by being in it, about the first time he had seen her at a neighbor's house, and understood with the immediate certainty of a man who generally distrusts certainty that this was going to change everything. Nora listened. She asked questions. She felt not jealousy she had expected jealousy had braced for it, but it did not come, but something more like reverence for the woman whose choices and love and loss had shaped the people she was coming to love. She would have liked you, Jonathan said at one point. You can't know that. I know what she valued. He looked at her steadily. Courage, honesty, people who say what they mean and do what they say. A pause. She would have liked you enormously. They packed Sarah's things with care. Her clothes folded neatly, her personal items wrapped, everything labeled for the boys when they were older. Jonathan handled each piece with the deliberateness of someone performing a ceremony, not erasing, but releasing. Not forgetting, but releasing. When they were done, the room looked different. Still beautiful. Still clearly a room that had been loved, but no longer sealed. What do you want to do with it? Nora asked. He looked around. Make it ours, he said. Whatever that means to you. She thought about it. A few of my books, she said. Different curtains. I'll keep the color just lighter. And, she paused. I want to hang her portrait somewhere we can see it. Not as a reminder of grief, as a reminder that she was real, and she mattered, and she is part of this family still. She looked at him. Is that? Yes, he said immediately. That's exactly right. She took his hand. They stood in the room that was becoming theirs, in the house that was becoming theirs, and held on. The night before the wedding, Nora could not sleep. This was not anxiety, not the cold, stomach-churning anxiety of the night before the first ceremony, when she had lain awake in a stranger's bed, wondering what she had agreed to. This was something else. A fullness, an awareness of the distance between where she had been and where she was, and the particular vertigo that comes with understanding that the distance cannot be fully measured. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch. Snow still lay in the shadowed hollows, but the open fields were brown and beginning to green. She could smell, even through the glass, the particular scent of Montana in late April hold, and mineral, and alive the smell of earth that has been frozen for months, and is now with enormous reluctance, and then sudden enthusiasm, remembering how to grow things. A soft knock at the door. She turned. It was Eli and Caleb in their nightshirts, looking sheepish, in the way of children who know they are supposed to be asleep and have decided something is more important. "We couldn't sleep," Eli said. "Neither could I." She opened her arms. "Come here." They climbed into her bed. Both of them, Caleb immediately burrowing under the quilt, with the efficiency of a child who has identified a warm location and intends to occupy it fully. Eli sat up beside her, more formal, but leaning against her shoulder. "Tomorrow's the big day," Caleb said from under the quilt. "It is." "Are you nervous?" She considered this honestly. "Not the way I was before. The first time." She paused. "This time I know what I'm choosing. That makes it different." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Mama," he said. And she had been Mama for weeks now to both of them, but she had not yet stopped hearing it with the same quality of attention, the same particular weight. "After tomorrow, nothing changes, right? Everything stays." She put her arm around him. "Everything that matters," she said. "Yes. What if—" He stopped. What if you have more children?" he said carefully. "Babies. Would we still—" "Eli." She turned to look at him directly. "You and Caleb are my sons. Full stop. No condition attached, no asterisk, no version of the future in which that is less true than it is right now." She held his gaze. "If your father and I have more children someday, they will be your brothers or sisters, and you will be their family. That doesn't divide anything. It adds to it." He looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that had seen too much, and were slowly learning to trust what they saw. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She agreed. Caleb from under the quilt announced that he was already asleep, which was demonstrably untrue, but graciously accepted. Nora told them stories, until it was true. Until both boys were breathing deeply. Caleb sprawled sideways with the architectural abandon of a sleeping 3-year-old. Eli still and quiet beside her. She lay in the dark with her sons, and listened to the house breathe around her, and thought about all the ways a life can go, all the wrong turns, and the doors closed, and the winters walked into with nothing in your hands, and how sometimes at the end of a long chain of terrible choices, and desperate moments and bargains made at the edge of survival, you arrive somewhere you would not have found any other way. She thought about what it meant to choose something, not to accept it, not to make peace with it, not to survive it, but to look at it with clear eyes and say this: "This is what I want. This is what I'm choosing." She was going to choose this. In the morning, she was going to walk across the meadow behind the house in a dress that was hers. Not Sarah's, not a dead woman's. Hers made for her over the past 3 weeks by the seamstress May had insisted upon. And she was going to stand in front of the people of this valley and speak the words she had spoken once before in a cold study to a cold stranger. And this time mean every single one of them. She fell asleep before she had finished the thought. The morning arrived gold and clear, the kind of spring morning that Montana saves for special occasions. May appeared at 7 o'clock with coffee and the particular energy of a woman who has been planning something for weeks and is now deploying it in full. The seamstress had delivered the dress the previous afternoon, cream linen with simple lines and a small spray of dried wildflowers sewn into the sash that Nora had insisted upon against May's gentle suggestion of something more elaborate. "You could have lace," May said, not for the first time. "I don't want lace," Nora said. "I want to look like myself." May looked at her in the dress, and her expression did the thing it did sometimes when she was feeling something she had decided not to say, and simply nodded. The meadow behind the house had been set with chairs borrowed from the neighboring ranches. Wildflowers that had begun to ush up through the snow-patched ground had been supplemented with early blooms from the kitchen garden that May had coaxed into premature color by sheer determination. The minister from Crestwood stood at the far end of the aisle, not Judge Alderman, not a contract being executed. A minister who had been told this was a celebration and had dressed accordingly. The people of the valley had come. Not all of them. She did not have illusions about all of them, but enough. Enough that when she stood at the edge of the meadow waiting, she could look out at a gathering that represented something real, a community that had failed her and was trying imperfectly to do better. Charlie stood beside Jonathan at the end of the aisle. Jonathan's dark suit, the same one he had worn to the first ceremony. But different now, he stood differently. He stood like a man who is somewhere he has chosen to be. Eli stood on his father's other side, holding the rings on a small wooden box May had found somewhere, with an expression of concentrated solemnity that could not quite conceal how much he was trying not to smile. Caleb stood beside Nora, holding her hand, dressed in his best, with his hair combed into a state that would not survive the reception, and announced to anyone within earshot, "That's my papa and that's my mama, and today they're getting really married." May, from 2 rows back, made a sound that was clearly a sob, presented as a cough. Nora walked down the aisle, through the meadow with Caleb's hand in hers and the spring sun on her face, and felt with the clarity that only certain moments possess that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, not because she had no choice, because she had chosen it every day, from the moment she took his hand in the cold study to the moment she stood in the parlor with a fireplace poker and said, "This is my family," to a man with a knife. She had chosen this. She reached the end of the aisle. Jonathan looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been learning to read since the beginning. The one she now knew completely. Not assessed, not managed, not defended. Fully present, fully here. "You look," he said, and stopped. "Like myself," she said softly. "Yes," he said, "exactly like yourself." The minister opened his book. "Friends and neighbors, we are gathered today to witness and celebrate the marriage of Jonathan Hale and Nora Calloway Hale. These 2 people have asked us to witness their choice freely made to build a life together, to be partners, to be a family. Jonathan, do you take Nora as your wife, not from necessity, not from arrangement, but from the choice of a man who knows his own mind and his own heart?" Jonathan looked at her. "I do," he said. "I choose Nora. I choose her every day from this one forward. Nora, do you take Jonathan as your husband freely, fully, with clear eyes?" An open heart, she looked at him. At this man she had walked toward through a snowstorm with nothing in her hands. At these boys who were hers. At this house behind her, this valley around her, this life that had been built from the most unlikely materials. "I do," she said. "I choose this. All of it. I choose it because I want it, not because I have to, not because I have nowhere else to go." She paused. "Because this is home." Eli, looking down at the box in his hands, pressed his lips together very tightly. The minister smiled. "By the power vested in me and witnessed by this community, I declare these two to be married in the fullest sense, in law, in love, and in life. Jonathan, you may kiss your wife." He did. It was not brief, and it was not impersonal, and it was nothing at all like a forehead kiss in a cold study. It was the kind of kiss that made May stop pretending it was a cough and simply cry, that made Caleb say, "Ew!" in a tone that suggested he did not mean it, that made Charlie look at the middle distance with the expression of a man experiencing an emotion he intends to deny having. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. The valley cheered. The reception lasted until the stars came out. May had been cooking for days. The tables in the yard were covered with more food than the valley had probably seen in one place since before the winter. Children ran between them. Ranch hands who had put on their good boots stood awkwardly at the edges until someone found a fiddle, and then they stood less awkwardly. Jonathan and Nora danced. He was not a graceful dancer. He moved like a man who has learned the steps and executes them conscientiously rather than naturally. But he held her like someone who has found something he intends to hold on to, and she moaned. She did not care at all about the grace. Eli danced with May very seriously, as if the correct execution of the dance steps was a matter of personal honor. Caleb danced with everyone. He danced with Mrs. Patterson, who looked startled and then delighted. He danced with Mr. Chen, who laughed for the first time in Nora's experience of him. He attempted to dance with Charlie, who declined, and with one of the ranch dogs, who also declined. At one point in the evening, Jonathan took her hand and led her away from the celebration down the path that ran east of the house to the small rise overlooking the valley, the same rise where Sarah's marker stood. "I come here sometimes," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know." She stood beside him. "Eli takes me sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. "I want her to be part of this," he said. "Not as something that prevents anything, as part of what made it possible, if that makes sense." "It makes complete sense." He reached into his coat pocket. He held out a ring. Not his mother's band she wore, that on her right hand, now moved there by mutual quiet agreement weeks ago. This was new, a slim gold band, set with a stone the color of the Montana sky on a clear day. "I had it made," he said. "I wanted to give you something that was only ours." She held out her left hand. He slid it onto her finger. It fit exactly. "How did you know the size?" she asked. "I measured the band you wear while you were sleeping," he said with complete seriousness. She stared at him. "That is either very romantic or very alarming," she said. "I prefer to think of it as practical," he said, and smiled the full, real, undefended smile that she had first seen at the porch rail and had been trying to see again ever since. She laughed. The sound of it surprised her, full and genuine, rising up into the spring evening without reservation. He took her face in his hands and kissed her again, softer this time, in front of Sarah's marker and the darkening sky, and the sounds of the celebration drifting up from the house below. "Thank you," he said against her mouth. "For what? For staying." He pulled back enough to look at her. That first night when you took my hand, you were terrified. I could see it, and you stayed anyway." She thought about that woman, the one who had been frozen at a fence post with nothing left, who had walked into a stranger's study and accepted an impossible bargain, and discovered on the other side of it that she was braver than she had known. "I was terrified," she agreed, "but I was right to stay." "Yes," he said, "you were." They stood together as the last of the light left the sky, husband and wife on the rise above their valley, until Caleb's voice came floating up from below. "Mama, Papa May, says there's cake," and they looked at each other and went home. 3 months later, on an evening in July, when the sun went down late, and the air smelled of grass and horses, and the good, clean smell of a summer that has been doing its job properly, Nora and Jonathan sat on the porch after the boys had gone to bed. This was their habit now, their hour, the one that belonged to them after the household had quieted. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they read side by side in the warm dark. Sometimes they simply sat and let the evening be what it was. This evening, Nora set down her book. She reached over and took Jonathan's hand, which was resting on the arm of his chair. She turned it over, placed it flat against her middle, just below her ribs. He went very still. She watched his face. She watched him understand. For a moment he did not move. Then his hand of its own accord pressed gently, carefully against her. Not the clinical assessment of their early days, not the unconscious contact of the weeks that followed, but something deliberate and full. He looked at her. His eyes in the low summer light held something she had been watching for since February, since the porch in the snow. Since the key in her hand, since the moment she had understood that two people could make a bargain in winter and find on the far side of it something they had not thought to ask for. He was not afraid. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Completely." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised her hand from where it rested over his and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was so careful and so full that she had to look away for a moment at the dark fields beyond the fence, breathing slowly, letting the feeling settle. "We should tell the boys," she said finally. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight, I just want to sit with it." She nodded. They sat together in the warm dark, the valley quiet around them, the house behind them full of sleeping children, and the particular peace of a household that has earned its rest. Nora looked at the stars coming out overhead, the same sky that had pressed down cold and close the night she walked toward these gates with nothing in her hands, and thought about what it meant to choose a life, not to be handed one, not to survive into one, to look at it with clear eyes and say yes. This. I want this. She had wanted this. She had chosen it every day since the moment she took a stranger's hand in a cold study and said, "We have an agreement," not knowing yet what she was to us, was agreeing to, not knowing yet that the agreement was only the door, and that what was behind the door was something that could not be contracted for and could not be lost once it was found. The stars continued to appear one by one, the way they do. Unhurried, inevitable, each one a small insistence that the dark is not the whole story. Winter had brought her here. But there's this porch, this man, these boys asleep in the house behind her. This life she had not known to ask for. This was home. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because this was the only place she had ever wanted to stay.